And here
All
we
right.
go. Yeah, awesome. We have my dear friend and longtime comrade Maria Lozano on today to talk about her book and the violence against women in Juarez, but as part of a larger milieu of capitalism and neoliberalism and politics of the border and all of that. And first of all, kudos. This book has really done really well in terms of leaving an impression on folks and really being seen as a starting point now for talking about violence at the border and neoliberalism and the after effects of NAFTA and all of those things. How did you think that, you know, coming in from your angle as a communication theorist would be maybe the right angle to ask these questions?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. As a longtime friend and colleague, I'm just so happy to be here and honored to be here with you. So thank you for inviting me. This project has really been a labor of love. I've been working on the Feminicidios since 2003. So
Yeah, you've been on this a long time, and you've gone down there and you have been in the field.
I have. And, you know, one of the things that really was important to me was really having the kind of blessing from the family members and the activists. One of the things I learned early on was that, and, you know, this isn't surprising, but that scholars would go down there. You know, it was this kind of sexy topic in the early 2000s. And, you know, they would go down there and do an interview and, you know, take from the community and never give back to that community. And so people would say, you know, when is your book going to be done? When is your book going to be done? And I would try to articulate that it takes a long time when you're doing work in the field to garner trust from those community members. And so even before the book was finished, I took back my data and my analysis to the family members and to the activists to really ensure that this project was being done properly.
I am reading a review, and this is from, let's see here, looks like this is the Women's Studies in Communication review. So Michaela Torres, I believe, writing this in her recent book, Not One More, Feminicidio on the Border. Maria Lozano asks readers to interrogate the relationship between neoliberalism, material property, and the ongoing wave of feminicide. I am sorry that I'm mispronouncing that this morning.
Well, no, actually, and that's part of we can talk about how the name, even the term has evolved.
Yeah.
Because it started as femicide,
right,
and then went to feminicides, and now we're at feminicidios. But you
I
can
noticed
say,
that
just
this
say
morning.
femicide, it's fine.
Feminicidio, which has plagued Juarez, Mexico for decades. This gendered violence is characterized by the continual disappearance, assault, mutilation, and murder of primarily young, low-income women in Mexico. The Mexican government denies the occurrence, rendering the systemic violence invisible and remaining complicit in its continuance. And so, and this review is a good encapsulation, again, of the theoretical work you do as a gateway to understanding the material relationships here, how capitalism and neoliberalism and border violence, all of these things together contextualize violence against women and poverty and all of these other intersections.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I really tried to, the beginning of the book talks a lot about this like Hollywood intrigue surrounding the femicides. And we have to understand that first to kind of then springboard off of the theoretical, but it was very much this whodunit, you know, like who is killing the women of Juarez. And in fact, that was the name of a conference that was held in '03 at UCLA. And then, you know, it really evolved from there in my critique of how Hollywood commodified these killings, right? And very much sensationalized them. And I shifted the question from who is killing the women of Juarez to the question of what. What are the systems
Right.
at play that give rise to femicide in the first place? And so that was a really concerted shift on my part.
And you want to talk a little bit about the field work here. I mean, I think that there's definitely a stereotype of rhetoricians and other folks in the humanities kind of never leaving their offices as they work, and that is so different than the experience that you had.
Well, I like to think about myself as a scholar activist. And I've talked about this before, I think, and you've probably heard this too, the trope that, you know, when folks say my activism is in my scholarship. And I really question that because we can certainly write about things. But if we are going to be change agents in the world, I really feel that we have to take the privileges that we have, particularly those of us who are in academe, who have all this theoretical knowledge, whatever the issue may be, whether it be the environment or domestic violence or femicide, to be in the field, to be engaged in the world is really important. And so for me, I try to think of those things as inseparable.
And so what was it like? You know, do you have any good stories or anecdotes about maybe things that you learned about yourself or about the work that you hadn't really suspected or hadn't known until you were able to actually, you know, be in the physical geography?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so much. When I first started researching the Feminicidios, I participated in a really powerful event called the Caravan for Justice, which really was a consciousness raising event that started in Canada, went through the United States, and then ended powerfully with across the border in El Paso. And the Caravan for Justice was my first attempt to really be in the field, as it were. And so we stopped at various locations and had critical interrogations of feminicidios with the mothers of the victims. And that's really, really important. So giving them a voice, creating spaces for their narratives to circulate was really, really powerful. And we thought that consciousness raising is great, but we also need to make demands. And so along that journey, we ended up in the Chihuahua governor's palace, where we held meetings with members of the government officials and took those demands from the family members directly to the state, which was extremely powerful. And some of the demands were granted, others were not. But it really started off this framework of the circulation of discourse in the public sphere for the purpose of going beyond consciousness raising, making demands. And there have been many, many protests on both sides of the border. And being in the field, for me, you know, one of the things I always tell my students is we are not here to solve the problem, right? We are not the ones with the answers. The community members have the answers. And so we act in solidarity with, and that's something that's really, really important to me. And so, you know, as a young scholar, I had all these ideas. I was just out of my doctoral program, you know, here's what needs to happen. Here's what we need to do. And just completely inverted that model into attempting to learn, to listen, to understand, and then eventually getting to a point of collaboration where in the field, in addition to the protests and the demands, we've gone out and painted murals. There's a chapter in the book called The Faces of Femicide, because as you mentioned in that review in Women's Studies and Communication, the rhetoric of the government is still very much so that this is a dark legend, that this is a dark myth. And so the Faces of Femicide mural project was one example, in addition to protests, where we worked on numerous murals that tell the stories of the victims, that show that their lives were real, that these were the things that that these individuals were living. And what's really interesting about that project is the government then tried to co-opt the project, and they would make a mural where it would just be like a face and a rose, a face and a rose. And, you know, we were working with people, Yuvia, who is one of the artists featured in the book, Raya Rocho, would take the time to interview the families and the family members and learn about their lives. And you can just, I kind of juxtapose these murals side by side, and you can just see that even in the mural project, the government was commodifying like an assembly line, just these images with no stories, no narratives, no background. That was a really important project that we undertook. We also went out and painted crosses around the city, and the painting of crosses is really important because it is in the public consciousness. Then, you know, it's always there as a reminder, but also as a warning. So many of the crosses that are put are where the bodies have been found, so that individuals know to be safe around these particular areas. And also a warning to the state from the activists that we know, right? We know what's happening. We know who the players are that are involved. In addition to the painting of the crosses, probably one of the most powerful experiences that I've had is actually conducting searches for the victims out in the Chihuahua Desert. In Spanish, those would be called rastreos, or searches. And because of the ineptitude and the impunity of the government does not search. The government does not search for the women. So these citizen action committees have been taken on by the activists, by the family members. They are very well organized to go out in the field and look for any DNA, any bones, any remains, any clothing, anything that can then be taken back to try to identify the victims. And of course, in all of these, we would run into pretty significant suppression strategies, you know, by the state. And so it's always a precarious place. But again, being in the field, those are just a few examples of the importance of being in the field to really understand the conditions that are taking place around the impunity.
I've done, you know, just a minimal amount of field work in legal research internationally, and I know that that navigating those public officials is tricky, and I can only imagine that it was tricky on steroids in Juarez. What are some of those evasive strategies or intimidation tactics? Are there any of those that you can recall or speak to?
Yeah, I mean, well, the book talks about different strategies of suppression by the state, and I'll talk about just a few of those.
Sure,
I
thank
mean,
you.
one of the things that we ran into numerous times was the falsification of evidence. So that's a strategy that the state uses. Harassment, particularly with the mothers being followed. It's important to note that there have been numerous activists that have been assassinated. So obviously the strategy of purgation is real. There have been numerous journalists that have been assassinated that have been attempting to expose the government involvement with the femicides. But their strategies are very hegemonic in that, you know, in addition to falsification of evidence, their rhetoric is very much that these women live double lives, right? That they were prostitutes or they were on the wrong side of the tracks as a way to decredit, you know, the the killings of these women in a way that somehow they were asking for it, right? And we know this happens on a regular basis with any work in gendered violence. But there's also been torture and scapegoating. And so one of the things that we were able to do in the field, which was a little bit risky, was we were able to get into the prison where a man by David Mesa was tortured into a confession in the killing of his cousin. And we were able to get in. They only took a few of us in, but we were able to get his testimony about the killing. And that was really, really important because we were having protests here in Los Angeles at the Mexican consulate every Friday demanding his release. And, you know, at first they took us on this wild goose chase and they told him he wasn't available. And then we were at the wrong prison. I mean, so these revolving door kind of strategies and tactics are continually something that the movement has to contend with.
We are here with Nina Maria Lozano, and we are discussing her book, Not One More, Feminicidio on the Border. This is a book about the murder of women in Juarez and the politics and rhetoric surrounding it. And if we were to pan backwards and get a bigger picture of sort of the whole history of this question, what would you tell people initially about the relationship of things like NAFTA and other neoliberal policies and how they have contextualized Juarez?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question. So I mentioned earlier that I tried to move it from the who to the what. And so I was really looking for something to anchor this book to. And I think it's important to speak just for a minute about my theoretical approaches to this question. And I don't know if you've heard about this turn in academe to new materialism. I don't know if you've heard a little bit about that.
Just a little bit, but I was hoping you would tell me more.
Yeah. So there's been this really, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's been a very popular turn in our field talking about new materialism, which has to do with granting inherent agency to objects and things. And so there's all this literature about objects and things being inherently vibrant. And so my book takes on this theoretical construct of new materialism. And I'll just read kind of my thesis, which says, I contend that the post-humanistic new materialist turn is fraught with dangers in its disavowal of human agency, in its complicity with neoliberal capitalism, and through its fetishization of object-oriented things, and where political movements are disarmed. And so there actually is scholarship about things like speed bumps and beer hops. I mean, these
attributing agency to them in some way.
Yes, attributing agency to them.
So basically, it's magical realism. It's just
magical realism.
A repurposing of magical realism for rhetorical theory, to supplant actual materialism.
Right, exactly. And so, of course, knowing me, there's no surprise that I make an argument that we need to go back to Marx and historical materialism, and talking about the importance of rhetorical work with human agency. And so I advance a theory called border materialism, which enables me to provide a framework of how these object-oriented things and matter intersect with bodies, and in particular, women's bodies that are rooted in neoliberal economic structures. And that then opened up everything I needed to then just springboard off of that, to talk about border materialism as a way that can talk about neoliberalism, because there's no coincidence that the Feminicidios started in and around 1994, which was, of course, we know, the passage of NAFTA. And the passage of NAFTA brought these free trade zones on the border There are about 400 maquiladoras that employ about 300,000 Huarenses in the factories. And we can talk about, all of the harms. There's one chapter that I'm really proud of called, if I can turn here, let me pull it up just so I can get on the right page. Feminicidio and the enchanted assemblages of things. And I really critique this notion of enchantment, because the new materialism is very much this, I think, a very privileged position, one that disavows context, histories, economies, and politics. And so in here, I talk about how if we take objects as a starting point, but put them within a framework of historical materialism, it allows us to then look at the things and that intersect with bodies that lead to femicide. And so in this chapter, I look at the maquiladoras and all of the inherent risks and dangers that women are exposed to when they're working on the assembly lines. And this is important too, because NAFTA essentially decimated the campesinos in southern Mexico. They were forced to migrate to northern Mexico. And when arriving in northern Mexico, the only jobs that were available were those in the maquiladoras or in the factories. And this really upset the balance of gendered norms within the family, because the maquilas will only hire women. And they know this because women are easier to control, right? And so the chapter looks at how NAFTA, in conjunction with the feminicidios, plays into this neoliberal assemblage of things. Things have a history. And so I play on that with this notion of things on the assembly line, and the production of those things, and the dangers of women working within these places and spaces. So for example, the maquilas, they have grass, they have lights, they have safety mechanisms, they have alarms. In fact, there's a superhighway. They decimated a colony called Anapra to build this safe superhighway for the executives. And I juxtapose that with the conditions where people are living in houses, oftentimes built by what the things that have been discarded from the maquilas themselves. And also the fact that there are no safety mechanisms, there are no paved roads, there are no lights. And so thinking about it from a neoliberal perspective really afforded me the opportunity to get at things like the dangerous working conditions, the things like women are forced into forced pregnancy tests, things of that nature. And then it also afforded me an opportunity to look at strategies of resistance. And so, taking a new materialist term as this object, it doesn't give us any explanation. It doesn't give us any background. It doesn't give us any context. And so that chapter is one mechanism to really critique and then talk about why border materialism is necessary.
And what would you say if you had to kind of encapsulate border materialism? It reminds me of also some of the work that's been done in critical immigration legal studies about centering the migrant as sort of as kind of a central subject of political analysis, instead of seeing the migrant as something exceptional. And I'm wondering if there's some of that too in terms of what you're trying to do with border materialism.
Yeah, absolutely. And, border materialism, I should say, just as a reminder, we know that femicide is a global issue. And one of the things that, if people ask me to talk about femicide, I think it's really important to ask, well, what femicides are we talking about? Because if we look at the femicides in Argentina, the conditions are going to be very different there, and the things that give rise to femicide versus what's happening in Juarez. So,
or missing Native women up
exactly.
here in the sort of northwest part of the United States is also unique, but nevertheless interconnected.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so what are the conditions? What are the nuances? I would never, for example, as you point out with your example of missing Indigenous First Nation women, I would never attempt to speak on that subject, right? Because that's not a subject I have researched. But nonetheless, we know that they're interconnected globally, right?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for, kind of describing the importance of the theoretical approach here. It seems like when you take these approaches that create this kind of metaphysical relationships, or attribute the identity to things that divert our view of institutions and of material power. It seems like that is a real does a real disservice to
Mhm.
the material, to an analysis of the material antecedents and the corrupt power structures and all of the things that you're talking about, which had real concrete complacency and causation to these problems.
Yeah, and we need to talk about the fact that, I in the book I document how the rhetoric of the government is very much about, I mentioned this dark legend. And the reason for that is simple. It's capital, right? They want to restore Juarez to be kind of like Tijuana, this border town. I think about it like in the 80s, right, where everyone was partying in Tijuana.
Hmm.
Well, you had
Hmm.
the same thing in the main drag of Juarez, with the people from UTEP, coming over and partying, and there was huge amounts of income that the state and the corporations were making because of tourism. And so, there is a piece where I document that there's an inherent connection between the rhetoric of the dark legend and the need for the capital of the tourist industry. And so one of the things that, Juarez has done, rather than actually putting aside resources on this issue, continually mask it. So downtown in the main drag, they put in water fountains. They put in like a kind of a facelift, if you will, in that area. And one of the things that the mothers and the activists did, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is I talk about how they are able to transform place and space. And they do that through various rhetorical strategies, right? And so one of the things that is really powerful is, if you imagine a shopping mall, when you go into a shopping mall and you haven't been there before, you'll look for a directory of where different stores are, or different things that you're wanting to purchase. So one of the things to fight back against this logic of tourist-driven capital is that the mothers actually turn these shopping directories into missing persons. So instead
Wow.
of, yeah, and there's some images in the book as well. So instead of looking for where shoes are, next thing you know, you're looking at this image of one of the disappeared women with the information of who to contact and where she was seen, and what she looks like. And just completely radically change that logic of capital into this other narrative about the feminicidios. And that's just one example of, again, taking objects, but with human agency, so that object has, persuasive ability and also functions as demands. So that's one example.
This is so fascinating too, because of the way that that these activists, and so many activists in these very precarious situations, are the ones who are doing the most edgy and creative job at reinventing protest and reinventing dissent. How impressed were you with I don't know, kind of the innovation and the sort of gutsiness of these kinds of approaches to confronting public authority?
Yeah. Um, it's amazing, you know, but if you talk to, like, Jose Luis is one of the fathers, his daughter Esmeralda is on the cover of the book. I've worked closely with him, and, you know, his rhetoric is always, you know, there is no choice. There is no choice. You know, they're not looking, I have to look. And so constantly thinking about strategies of deployment, it's very, very strategic. It's very calculated. And it is very, very risky. I mean, he's been thrown in jail numerous times, as you could imagine. Especially with the public searches, because what intrigued me most about this new materialism, was the link between an inherent object's properties as being vibrant. So I have a chapter called Lifeless or Vibrant Matter. And I think it gets at your question, because they're going out in searches, and, you know, so the whole time we're searching, they just had these machine guns pointed at our heads and just following us around, when instead they could have been searching, right? You know, so there's that, but also that even if there is inherent vibrancy within the DNA, I argue that it, in and of itself, it's meaningless, because, as I mentioned earlier, there's often falsification of evidence, or they just, you know, end up in the back of a room and nobody investigates or does anything with those bones. And so even if you have something inherent like DNA, it still takes agency, and it still takes protest, to get that DNA analyzed. And in fact, the family members have brought in external folks to analyze some of the DNA, because the government cannot be trusted. So they brought in, it was actually the same forensics team that identified bodies at 9/11. The forensics team from Argentina, the forensics team from Argentina. And you mentioned kind of this, you know, what I observed in the face of these suppression strategies and tactics. Searches is one thing, but then they realized also that none of the DNA was being examined. So currently, what many of the activists are doing is they're actually getting trained in forensic science, and they have started themselves cataloging the bones and cataloging clothing or whatever item it is that they have found. And they have essentially started their own forensic science lab, if you can think about it in that way. And so the ingenuity, the persistent nature of this, is just, it's constantly mind-blowing to me about the work that's being done.
What an amazing testament to kind of the way in which people can become specialists in the process of dismantling or confronting oppression. And it's almost I almost think of the Paris Commune, and I think of how people, you know, said, well, we can run these things, we can run all of these, we can become the experts. And the, you know, this sort of demarcation of expertise itself collapses when society, when the legitimacy of these power structures also collapses, and people sort of take over the process themselves. I mean, that sounds very theoretical, but it's a very practical kind of seizure of the means of power.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And in chapter 5 of the book, I talk about precisely that. I make the argument that they are literally enacting the role of the state. Yeah.
Right, right. They are, and in doing so, you know, sending this very important message about, you know, what, you know, this answer to this kind of retort of, well, what, you know, what would you do without us? You know, what would you do without our authority or without our expertise? And, you know, now you have the state's not protecting you, and you are doing a bunch of the things that they are supposed to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's definitely taking on the role of the state, but then there's also eschewing the role of the state. And I talk about, in the Maquiladora sector, I have a mini case study of a group. It's really fascinating. There were a group of nuns called the Sisters of Tonantzin that came through Anapra, which is very close to the Maquiladora sector where many of the laborers work. And they taught them how to build ecological toilets because it was a desert. You know, it is a desert. And so they, many of the women quit their jobs at the maquilas and started working full time on these ecological toilets, which they can sell, but also then turn their community into a place where they can farm, where they can grow, because they had no sanitation there because the government didn't provide it. And so I'm also really interested in looking at these alternative economies or different strategies of resistance that, in addition to one strategy of taking on the role of the state, another strategy is rejecting the paradigms that are in place and creating alternatives.
Shifting gears just a bit, but I think springboarded by what you were just talking about. Do you talk a little bit about the role of religion and spirituality in all of this, both as an oppressive force and also as sort of the maybe the seizure of spirituality as potentially a catalyst to liberation as well?
Well, that's really an interesting question because many of the family members have strong faith, strong Catholic faith, and they've actually used that strategically. So thank you for the question. One of the things that they've done is, as I mentioned, the government will oftentimes articulate the women who have disappeared, the girls who have disappeared, as prostitutes. So one of the things that they've done is utilize their religion to put out images, and this is very common. If a woman or girl has disappeared, they have her photo up of her first communion, therefore invoking this notion of being pure or innocent. And now, of course, there's problems with that, right? With the whole virgin whore dichotomy and perpetuating that.
Yeah.
So we know that that's there as well. And so we have, it is a fine line as a strategy. But and also using photos of things that are very familial, religious, like the first communion, but also their their quinceañera photos is often something that we see. When the women marched and the activists 1 year from the state of Chihuahua to Juarez proper, and just to give you a sense, I don't know the exact mileage, but it's a 6-hour drive from Juarez to Chihuahua, and they walked that entire distance, raising awareness, forming protests along the way.
It's got to be like 400 miles, something like that.
Yeah. And I actually have a VHS tape with it documented. Wow. When they were selling the tapes to raise money for the movement back then. But there is a monument at the border that currently stands, which I think is actually really powerful, because I talk about how I talked about the pink crosses, how when you cross in a particular space, it's a line of demarcation that this is a place in space where femicide is occurring. And so they took these railroad ties from Chihuahua to erect this huge monument that still stands on the border of El Paso and Juarez. And the government kept taking it down. They kept demolishing it, and then the family members would put up another one, and then the government would take it down, and the family members would put up another one. And then the family members came up with an idea that if they took their priest to the actual monument, to the monument that stands at the border, and have the priest bless it with holy water, then no one would touch it. And in fact, they were correct. And so since that priest blessed it with holy water, the state will not touch that monument, and today it stands.
The dynamics that are at work with all this are just so fascinating. Did you find parallels, or did you think about parallels between the other kinds of disappearances that have occurred, you know, throughout Latin America, in terms of people who were disappeared by the government, maybe different types of focal points of violence, but the resistance to that through the Mothers of the Disappeared, for example. I keep thinking about parallels in my mind between those two phenomena.
Yeah, absolutely. The Plaza de Mayo and thinking about that, right? Absolutely. There's so much there. And if you talk to the mothers, they're very aware of these histories. They're very aware and tapping into those in the public consciousness and thinking about their current strategies. Absolutely. And you know, even with current movements going on right now, you know, we had the Me Too movement here in the United States that became also in Latin America a hashtag for, it used to be Not One More, which is, you know, the title of the book. And then that shifted because other Latin American countries were using the hashtag Ni una menos, not one less. It doesn't translate that well in English, but essentially meaning like one is too many. And so the movement in Juarez has joined with other Latin American movements around the Ni una menos. And in fact, this was after the book was published. I believe it was last year. I can't remember the month, but there was a strike about the femicides in Latin America, and it was a labor strike where everyone on one, it was similar to perhaps our Day Without an Immigrant here in the United States. And so it was a day without women in all forms of labor. And that was the first time there had ever been a national strike around femicide within these other Latin American countries. So we're seeing more and more of these connections between movements across borders and across countries.
I know we've got a lot of communication folks, students and scholars watching this and listening to this. We also have a lot of activists from all kinds of places and organizations who are watching. What are some of from the standpoint of your academic discipline? What are some of, can you talk a little bit about some of the new voices and directions that are coming out, and maybe as a result also of the intensity of the last 4 years in terms of particularly of immigration politics? How are some of those things shaping your discipline and maybe producing some new voices?
That's a great question. And it's an exciting time and also a frustrating time. So a couple of years ago, there was a movement within the communication studies discipline called Communication So White. And it really shook up the discipline, critiquing, you know, what types of things are getting published, who's getting cited. I mean, we know that citational, the act of citing is political. And so Communication So White really forced journal editors to look at who's on their editorial boards, what types of articles are being accepted. There was a big shakeup for our Distinguished Scholar Award, and how the litany have just been these white men, right, for so long. And where are the people of color? Where are the people of color on these boards? Where are the people of color in these awards that are constantly, you know, producing stellar work, but continually being overlooked? And so there is a page, I think I sent that to you, Communication Scholars for Transformation, which I look at as kind of this subaltern public, you know, thinking about Nancy Fraser's work as a place for testing ideas and arguments and then taking them out to wider publics. And that Facebook page has been, I think, really radicalized the field. And so I think that to me, this is a really exciting time to continually fight for representation And, you know, that's just a few examples of the shakeup that's happening in our field right now, and really forcing accountability.
Any new exciting voices that you would like to maybe signal boost?
Oh, wow, you're putting me on the spot.
Sorry about that. I just wondered if you had it in
Um,
mind.
Gosh, I don't know if I'd want to. I don't know off the top of my head. Come back to me, and I'll give you a few that are really exciting voices.
Certainly, certainly. Well, it is really exciting to see, and I think that people, if you're not really familiar with the communication discipline and not just rhetoric, but I think communication studies as a whole, it's an interesting phenomenon because it's so ubiquitous in universities. It's often one of the largest majors. It's
Mhm.
often a site where, in terms of general ed, you know, tons of people go through various programs, and so it matters in a way that if you're not really familiar with all of those logistics, you might not really understand why talking about the transformation of the communication discipline is really talking about the transformation of academia in general, and a discipline that people are going to be exposed to as undergraduates, whether they ultimately are communication majors or not. And I know that, you know, my own experience in the discipline was one where there was so much tension between folks who kind of wanted to use the discipline as a way to make better workers and to make
Mhm.
corporations communicate better, and to, you know, to do PR, you know, basically for big capital, you know. And on the other hand, you know, scholars who you know, comfortably referred to the, you know, establishment rhetoric as the dripping laughing death face, and so I feel like that tension was really defined in so many ways my memories of the discipline. And so to know that it's changing and interrogating some of those you know, white patriarchal capitalist foundations is
Mhm.
really, to me, an exciting piece of news.
Yeah, I would say, and also the exciting piece of news with activism in the field, that, you know, departments are demanding that these types of actions, you know, beyond serving on a committee, for example, that activism should count towards tenure and promotion, and writing those into tenure and promotion documents, you know, is something that folks are pushing for. Think a lot of folks have already done it, and there's also you know, a real excitement around engaged learning in the field, which when you know, when you and I were together, that wasn't a thing, you know. And so for me, taking the fact that activism is trying to be counted is really important, and opens up, I think, our view of what it means to be a scholar. So like I said earlier, I constantly say I'm an activist scholar, I'm a scholar activist, you know, just trying to get that in there, to really mark what should count if we are talking and theorizing about inequality. We should be counting the projects, because so many of us in the field are doing projects in communities. And so, you know, when Black Lives Matter started taking off, you know, it also brought to bear things like decolonizing the syllabus. And so, you know, universities now, even if you look at the discussions in higher ed, has really permeated that as well.
And how has this research and this writing also informed uh, your political activity and kind of the energy that you bring to politics outside of some of these academic circles? Have you been able to engage in direct political action, maybe somewhat informed by by this scholarship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in Los Angeles, where, you know, if there's a protest going on, it's probably going to be happening in LA too, so, immigration, Black Lives Matter, labor, these are all things that are really important to me. And so, the Feminicidio stuff has been hard, because, my work is in Mexico. And so because of the narco violence, it was really hard to even get approval from the university to do that work over there because of risk management.
Right, right.
But I would say now, because of COVID, it's even more crippling. And so it's just, it's a somewhat of a frustrating time right now.
We've been talking to Nina Maria Lozano about her book, Not One More, Feminicidio on the Border. It's a book about the murder of women in Juarez and the politics and rhetoric of the border, the failure of institutions, the failure of authority, the history of neoliberalism, all of these things. I would love for you to take a little time as we wrap up here and talk about what work you're going to be, what work you have ahead of you, and some things that you might be excited about that are coming up.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Yeah, actually, I'm working on a book proposal right now. It looks like I'm going to be working with the same editor at the Ohio State University Press, which is really exciting. And I'm taking my work to the next step. Well, two things. One is I'm working on with a professor in Juarez of getting my book published in Spanish. That's really, really important to me to get that done. So there's that. But I'm also turning my work to extend this project to look at feminicidio and asylum. And so that's the next book project that I'm working on.
That's great and wonderful, because I have so many friends and valued partners around the country involved in asylum work as well, and so they will be really excited to hear about this. That's wonderful. You must be really heuristically excited to be able to synthesize those ideas.
Yeah, and it's a new research trajectory, a new line of inquiry for me. But there are many cases. There's one woman, and I won't say her name, but she's here in Long Beach that has been stuck in the system. There really isn't a legal path forward for femicide and asylum.
No, because it doesn't fit into the very, very tight and kind of archaic categories of asylum law.
Right, absolutely. And so thinking about it on both sides of the border, I'll be conducting interviews and looking at the testimonies from the women, but also looking at the legal categories and the movements around gendered asylum. So I'm just getting started.
Well, I'm excited for you. I'm excited for the trajectory of politics that are centered around these questions of border politics and migrants, and obviously deeply disturbed by the continuing cover-ups and the continuing ways in which institutions evade accountability and responsibility, and also, continuously frustrated by people's by the refusal of powerful groups and powerful institutions to kind of put the pictures together and understand that there is a material relationship between, that these are not aberrations, that and they're not the result of some kind of metaphysical disorder or something like that, that these are real consequences to real systems. And when you do the work that you do, I think it gives a lot of people hope that there are, still spaces of very important critical discourse in academia, and that ultimately those spaces, have to be filled by some kind of materialism, some kind of accounting for the relationship between these big economic systems and these localized instances of injustice and oppression. And so you're building that bridge. That's what you're doing, and it just feels so important to me.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Feminicidios. And I don't know if there were any questions. I can't see who's in the chat, but it's just been a pleasure.
I didn't see any questions the last time I looked, but I did see a bunch of thumbs up and a bunch of hearts and a bunch of thank yous and
Awesome.
good works and things like that. Do you have maybe a website or some other thing that you would direct people to if they wanted to learn more about your work?
Oh, thank you. Well, the title of the book again is called Not One More, Feminicidio on the Border. It's probably backwards. And you can Google that. I would also point you to a documentary that I collaborated with BuzzFeed, which has been really exciting because it's gotten over 500,000 views, so things like that. I really believe in critical documentaries. And so if you Google what is happening to the women of Juarez, BuzzFeed, it's a short documentary, but that also will give folks some more information.
Fantastic. And we will post that on our Facebook page as well as our Twitter page. Once again, I want to thank Nina Lozano for coming on. It's been way fucking too long since we have collaborated either for for good purposes or for more nefarious purposes. And I miss those days very much. Go Beach.
Go Beach.
And thank you again. Give my love to Dana. And again, thank you so much for sharing so much of yourself and your work. It's so easy, I think, to take routes that that are not personally taxing, that are not that don't weigh in so much on our consciousness and our conscience and history and all of those things. And instead, what you're doing is just putting so much of yourself out there. And I just know that a lot of people really appreciate that work.
Thank you, Matt.
All right.
I love you so much.
I love you too, Nina. I can't wait to see you when things cool down a bit, metaphorically speaking. Then I'm totally out there and would love to catch up with you all.
It's happening.
Thank you so much. This has been Solidarity House Morning Show. You can support our work at patreon.com/Solidarity House. We've got a bunch of stuff coming out on our podcasts. Our latest podcast, of course, is Kelly Potter on the relationship between Marxism and transgender liberation. This episode with Nina will be out on a podcast soon. You might be listening to it that way right now. So check out our work, Solidarity House Cooperative. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. Thanks again, Nina.
Thank you.